Hello, I'm Peter Forkingham. This seminar accompanies a paper published recently in Biology Letters, and you can find the links to that in the description for this video. In that paper and this seminar, I'll be talking about dinosaur locomotion, reviewing the methods used to elucidate and understand how dinosaurs moved. From the very earliest records of dinosaurs, people have wanted to know how they looked in life. Think how an extinct animal would have lived relies heavily on locomotion. Locomotion has effects on how they procreate, behave, play, find prey and evade predators, how they forage, and ultimately how they get from A to B. Locomotion even affects things like their stature, posture, the way their legs are oriented. So ultimately, it's pretty fundamental to reconstructing what they would have looked like in life. In fact, I'd argue that whilst we've certainly seen some superficial changes, such as increases in feathers, it's actually locomotor research that has most dramatically affected how we look at these extinct animals. I'm going to outline for you 4 avenues of research, 4 sources of information. We start with extant animals, that's animals alive today. We have the bones themselves, of course. We have reconstructed musculature around those. And we have fossil footprints, or tracks. It's tempting to jump straight to the bones. They are, after all, what many of us go to the museum to see in the first place. Well, we really must look at extant animals first. The reason being, most of our fundamentals and principles of how biological systems move are derived from observations and measurements of living animals. If we want to look at how large animals move, we might examine an elephant or a rhino and compare how their posture and limb motions and movements differ from small. The second reason to study extant animals is that as we come up with methods for studying locomotion in extinct animals, we need a way to test those methods. So if we have a new computer simulation that can figure out how an animal moved just from its bones, well, we have to test that with a living animal where we can verify if the answer is correct or not. So living animals provide our fundamentals and our validation test cases. Now that we have this in our back pocket, we can start looking at the dinosaur remains directly. It's worth noting that the living animal aspect feeds into everything else I'm going to be talking about, and I'll keep coming back to it as we go forward. But let's move on to studying dinosaur bones directly. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the animal we're looking at, the bones can't move on their own. They need muscles. We'll get to in a moment. But they can still tell us a lot about dinosaur locomotion. The size of the animal, the range of motion at the joints, the length of the limbs. These are all factors that determine how an animal moves. We'll start with the mass. This is something I've worked on myself. So we can get mass from the bones in 2 ways. The first is through a scaling relationship, where we measure something like the circumference of the femur or the humerus. We relate that to the size of the animal, using extant animals to provide that data. This provides a regression from which we can predict mass from just that one measurement. This has the advantage that you only need 1 or 2 bones from a skeleton in order to get an idea of how much that animal weighed. The downside is there's a lot of scatter in that regression, and so the number that you get out might not be particularly precise. The alternative is 3D modeling. Using a more complete skeleton, we can essentially draw a 3-dimensional outline around it and then apply a density to that volume. We can model in lungs and things if we want to get super detailed, or we can apply a density that takes those into account. The result is a more precise mass estimate for an individual. bones can also tell us about range of motion. That is, the possible poses. Now, soft tissues make this far more complex, but at a very basic level, we might consider rubbing two bones together. This is the humerus and the radius ulnar from a sheep. And there are hard stops that prevent the bones from moving further than this. And so it has a limited range of motion. Modern studies using X-ray techniques on living and cadaveric material can find out the effects of cartilage and other soft tissues, and we can backport that to dinosaurs to figure out the ranges of motion that the limbs might have had, which can help us constrain how they move. We can also look at the microstructure of bones. So inside these bones is a sort of honeycomb texture in places, and the way that texture orients can tell us the directions of stress, and that can tell us how the limb was held relative to the body mass. Here, we have an ichthyosaur that's been cross-sectioned, cut and sectioned, and then polished. So whilst the idea is the same, you're not seeing the same structures because the vertebrae aren't under load in the same way that the limb bones are, but you can see the microstructure here inside the bone. In order for the bones to move, we need muscles. Now, there are exceptional cases where some soft tissue might preserve with a dinosaur, but as far as we're concerned here, soft tissues don't preserve, at least not in the way that we need them to fully reconstruct muscles. So how do we know what muscles an animal had? Well, most tetrapods, that is, terrestrial animals, terrestrial vertebrates, have fairly conserved musculature, so there are lots of similarities between them. We can use the extant phylogenetic bracket, which for dinosaurs, crocodiles and birds. We can look at these two groups of animals, and anything they share, dinosaurs probably have too. But we can also see marks on the bones themselves, we call osteological correlates. Here on this Ophthalmosaurus leg, the fourth trochanter is a great example of this. This is where the large muscles in the tail, the chorda femoralis, would have attached to the top of the leg, pulling the leg backwards and driving the animal forwards. From that alone, we know that this animal was hip-based, swinging the leg from the hip, unlike modern birds, which swing the leg from the knee. It also tells us how far the muscle would have passed from the joint center itself, and that tells us the moment arc, which relates to the force, speed, and displacement a muscle can apply to a joint. The volume and cross-sectional area, therefore the force a muscle can generate, is less easy to constrain. Here we generally need to do what's called a sensitivity analysis, which is create a volume of muscle, usually with a 3D modeling program, and then shrink and expand it to points that it's unreasonable, finding the reasonable happy medium between them, and then running our analyses at extremes of what is plausible. Once we have the bone, the muscle position, and estimates of muscle volumes, we have the building blocks for a whole animal, at least the parts that move. What we can do is give those to a large computer and ask it to find optimal patterns of muscle activation and power to optimize for, say, speed or endurance. This is becoming more common as computational resources become more available to more people. One of the early studies to do this was Sellers et al., who applied genetic algorithms or optimization algorithms to make simulations learn to walk. And circling back to our living animals again, they used ostrich in humans to validate their method and found that their simulations produced ostrich in humans that ran at approximately the fastest speeds that humans and ostriches run. They then applied their model to large theropod dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus in order to pull out speeds. The final source of information is tracks or fossil footprint. This is my particular area of specialism. Whereas a skeleton can only be left behind once the animal is dead, the track is made by the animal while it's alive, while it's moving, while it's interacting with and passing through its environment. In that regard, a track can potentially record more motion information directly than any skeleton can. Dinosaur tracks appear in the scientific literature very shortly after the first osteological material was reported. In 1836, Edward Hitchcock reported on the dinosaur tracks from Connecticut Valley, Massachusetts. But he didn't know they were dinosaurs. The Dinosauria wasn't particularly well known at the time. Instead, he attributed them to large birds, now extinct, which in many ways, given they were often theropod footprints, was closer to the truth than some of the reconstructions we saw from the early osteological material. Again, we turn to modern animals to get our grounding in what we're looking at. One of the most common applications of dinosaur tracks and trackways to understanding dinosaur locomotion is through calculating speed from trackways. This is done based on an equation derived by Alexander in 1976, who looked at stride length and speed in a whole range of mostly mammal taxa, found a regression, found a relationship between these two things, and then produced an equation. He was then able to measure the stride lengths from a dinosaur trackway and calculate its speed. Alexander himself in 2006 was commenting that there is a lot of scatter in his data and these numbers are not in any way precise. And this is compounded by the fact that tracks are only left in compliant substrates. They're not left in hard surfaces. And so an animal is unlikely to be running at its fastest speed. So we're probably not going to get how fast could any given dinosaur run from its trackways. But they do tell us how these animals were moving habitually. Now, recent methods have looked at reconstructing the gait, that is the football patterns of dinosaurs. Jens Lalensack and I, and Kent Stevens and colleagues, used variations in stride length along long trackways to really constrain the order of footballs, finding that diagonal limb phase was common in sauropods, the trackways that we've looked at so far. We can also learn a lot from single isolated tracks. Sometimes skin impressions will be recorded, and small striations indicate the direction individual scales were moving against the mud. From this, you can reconstruct possible motions of the foot. However, it's actually going back to Hitchcock's tracks where we get some of the most information about motion. And I have a 3D print here of one. Now, Hitchcock actually collected these tracks in multiple surfaces and then strapped hinges to them. And you can literally flick through them like the pages of a book. You can see on the surface here, there's actually very little preserved except a little block where the foot is pulled out from the mud. And with colleagues here in the UK and in the US, we've been using these tracks to reconstruct foot motions from 200 million year old dinosaur tracks and essentially trace the path of the foot as it moved through the mud. We then used computer simulation to test if that motion actually does produce tracks like those that we see in the fossil record. And to bring this around to where we started, we've been using live animals, of course, guinea fowl in this case, to produce tracks and to understand how tracks form. So we're always bringing in those extant animals. So we have 4 sources of information. Extant taxa, which themselves provide the fundamentals and feed into everything else as validation and useful information. We have the bones themselves, which can tell us how large an animal was, its posture from its range of motion, its limb length relative to its body size, and so forth. The bones can often present muscle scars, and so we can reconstruct muscle positions and estimate their volumes. From the muscles and the bones and the information from extant animals, we can begin simulating how these animals might have moved. And from the fossil tracks, we can have another direction of information that tells us how these animals move. And when all these things come together and hopefully corroborate each other, we can really start to get confident interpretations of dinosaur locomotion. I hope this was interesting, and if it was, please do check out the paper for a more in-depth analysis of this. And also, please do visit my own website, where there's more technical information around the kind of things we do. Thank you very much.